Welcome to the channel. I'm David Poe. Thanks for joining us. For this painting, you'll need an 11 by 14 surface. This is a canvas panel. And my colors today are Hansa Yellow Light, Naphthol Red, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, Yellow Ochre, Ivory Black, Titanium White, and then a quick dry medium. These are all Utrecht products today. I've added more of the natural pigments with the burnt sienna and the yellow ochre and then the ivory black today, so you'll get to see that. These are very helpful pigments and relatively cheap. They are also convenience colors. You can certainly mix these with just the primaries. Here we begin with the sketch-in. I'm using a mixture here of ultramarine blue as well as naphthol red. One of the things I'm thinking about the composition, as you see the photo reference right on top of the screen, is that I'm trying to draw the viewer in, and this is more of a circular pattern. I'm bringing the viewer in from the left and then circling, hopefully kind of endlessly, as we go back into the painting. This is a risky composition in some ways, as you notice the valley that I'm pointing your interest to, which will be the focal point, is between these two hills that kind of converge at the entrance of this river, or creek rather. And it's almost dead center in the picture frame, which usually is not what you want to do. But I'm experimenting today to see if I can actually make it work, to draw the viewer in, to keep you engaged in the painting, and yet at the same time have that point of interest almost dead center. You've noticed I've actually moved it just slightly to the right hand side, so it's not quite center, but we'll see if just shifting it just a little bit will actually help. Now here I'm beginning to, and of course the topic today is painting from dark to light, painting your darks to your lights. You probably heard other artists tell you this, and maybe you understand that concept, maybe you don't. So let's begin. So I'm filling in with this same mixture the darks that you see. And we are basically going to do the entire block in today. You'll notice that I do not have an underpainting. This block in becomes the underpainting and can be very useful, especially if you're a beginner, to learn your tonal values. And tonal value just means how dark the color is or how light the color is, especially if you were to take a black and white photo of it. Regardless of what the hue is, the actual color of the paint, we're looking for just darks and lights. So as you can tell, even though these are in a distance, they strike us as rather dark because of these rock structures and how the sun is actually hitting the foreground area, much allowing a lot more light in that foreground than in the background. And so I'm just now sketching in the big shapes. I've probably mentioned that before in other videos, that you want to concentrate on just a few big shapes. So we got these two big rock areas in the back of the painting, and that's what I'm focusing in on now. And then you see the foreground area, so I'll be adjusting the color of this dark just slightly by adding just a little bit of titanium white. And bringing that in. And of course here, obviously that's a little bit lighter at the very apex of where these meet. It's also a good lesson to remember that I've visited these places, and so the photo reference is only a reference, mainly for me, for composition. I don't rely upon it necessarily for the colors. Your first focus should really be on color harmony and producing a good painting. We're not I'm not being intentional about attempting to make this photorealistic in terms of the painting. I'm an impressionist artist, or at least that's what I would consider myself, or some have called me an expressionist artist. I'm thinking more about conveying to the viewer the sense of how I felt. Well, I didn't feel so great about that falling down. Maybe that's helpful to put that reference up there. Some people like that, but it can be distracting because if you are attempting to focus only on how well I am managing to convey exactly the shapes and the colors that you see in the photo, then you've missed the point of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to use that reference photo simply for the composition. And even there, I may move a couple of things around in order to make this a more interesting painting as we move forward. This will be a good moment in this video to remind you that I would certainly appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, give a thumbs up, maybe even leave a question or some other comment below. That would really help the channel out. Here, just reestablishing some of the dark lines that we see that will help move the eye around. Now, a lot of this may very well be covered up later on. And that's also one of the things I want to show you today, that as you paint from your darks to your lights, that most of the time as you get the first initial layer in, and notice how thin I'm actually painting. I'm using a lot of Gamsol, and then the thinning down this the Utrecht colors of ultramarine blue mixed in with the Naphthol red. And so, number one, I want this layer to dry as quickly as possible. And I want it to be thin, so that way it'll enable me to come back over top of it with some lighter mixtures without too much trouble. Here you'll notice I'm pulling my brush strokes down for this particular shade. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit more titanium white involved as I am putting in what's going to become the lake or the water. And obviously none of this is going to remain, but it serves as a map as well as an underpainting basically that you would do in the studio, alla prima, all at one time. Or even if you were doing this outdoors and actually seeing the scene, which would be the preferred way to paint this, and then come back in the studio perhaps to do a larger work. Some artists claim that outdoor smaller paintings are just that. They're just studies for larger works, and many artists over the centuries have used it just for that. But I believe that in their own right, these smaller paintings can be works of art. And so even though I tend to, for anxiety purposes, call each of these just a study, I never call a painting actually complete before I've painted it. It helps me to realize that I'm just having fun with the painting, and so if it doesn't turn out, there's no harm done. I may lose the canvas that I've selected, but even among the most professionally trained and best artists in the world, they have plenty of canvases that do not work out well, and that you and I will never see. And so continue to remember that. If you end up painting, if you have observed your process, you're learning something from it, even if the finished painting is not something that you would end up even trying to sell. Although I would say that most of us that are in this hobby underestimate the beauty of our work, and that there are so many people out there that never even pick up the paintbrush or the paint and try to attempt this. And many of them are quite impressed with our even our humble works at the very beginning. So don't count yourself out too quickly. So here again, a very light purple with a little bit more titanium white. And so as you see this painting being developed, there are obviously some massive shapes that I've turned to here. And then essentially just a few values using the same color mixture. I haven't varied the colors that I'm using for this purple. It's just ultramarine blue and the Naphthol red. By the way, if you notice the difference in my palette today, Naphthol red is on there because it's a more modern color, but it doesn't have the heavy metals in it. It's essentially cadmium free, and it's still very permanent. And I'm testing that out. I do know that Utrecht makes some cadmium-free cadmium reds and yellows, etc. But they're quite expensive, and they still only produce those in what we would call the plein air variety, which would be the smaller tubes. I think it's 37 milliliters. To get the best value and bang for your buck, I would always recommend that you would buy the 150 milliliter tubes, especially for the studio. And then as those tubes get emptied, then I would just put those in your plein air pack and use the remaining smaller amounts, even if they're in the larger tubes, to take outdoors. And that way you've got a kind of a constant cycle then of buying new paint, and it will save you money in the end if you're buying the larger tubes, where the cost per ounce is much more in your favor. Of course, sometimes, especially if you're going to try out a few new colors, it's always good to maybe try out a 37 milliliter tube and see how well that works for you with a couple of paintings. Or another good resource is to just check on eBay. Sometimes folks get into painting, but they don't end up staying in it. And so sometimes you can pick up some used paint tubes relatively cheaply. Just be careful, do your research ahead of time. As you find, a lot of products on eBay are absolutely a ripoff. Sometimes you'll find folks that are trying to sell products at twice the price that you can get even from a retail store, because they're taking advantage of you not doing your homework. So always look up the prices first. Here I'm showing you some of the mixtures as we head into this painting now. Now the whole underpainting is done, and you notice that there are basically just different values of that same mixture, which help us to remember that the sky is going to be the lightest. The darkest, of course, are going to be your verticals, which would be in this case the mountain ranges and the terrain. The surface level, which in this case, instead of grasses, we've got this river valley that's we want to make sure that it's a little bit lighter than the other plains. And we're still working from the darks to the lights. And it's so much easier when you're working from the darks to have the lighter colors pop. In other words, one of the reasons why we work from dark to light is that if you start off too light, then there's just not enough contrast. There's nowhere else to go with your color mixtures, especially if you're using a limited palette. You will see here, this is not a very light green, but it doesn't have to be, because when it is placed on top of this rich, dark purple mixture, it helps the color pop out. And of course, purple and yellow are complementary, and so that will help both colors stand out more. It's a sort of a green, but it's a green that is certainly on the yellow side that I'm placing on the painting at this point. And here, what I'm doing is I'm looking at that reference, and I'm noticing some color shifts in the mountains that are in the background, basically. And I'm just editing most of it out, and just putting and making sure that my brush strokes sort of emulate those areas and the distinctions that I see. And I'm basically using that same mixture here, which is a Hansa yellow, which is a little bit of ultramarine blue, and then varying my brush strokes as I look at that reference photo and basically edit it down to the bare essentials. And that's what you really need to work on, especially if you're starting out with painting. How can you translate what you're seeing with all that detail and boil it down to simple brush strokes, simple mixtures at first, to give you the feeling and the essence of being there? You may even want to do some studies in which that's the only aim that you're trying, is to see how few brush strokes do you need to convey an impression of the scene. So notice I'm using a brush. I think this is a 6. It's a hog bristle brush made by Princeton. I use the cheap Ashley line. You don't necessarily have to buy the most expensive brushes, as long as they're a natural hair. I found these to be a really good value. Just showing you now as I'm changing the mixture on the palette. Notice too that I'm using the colors that are already on the palette as much as possible, and just shifting the color by mixing in what I need. So I'm not constantly scraping off the palette or trying to make a nice tidy color in one area of the palette and then someplace else another one. I do know other artists that try to do that, and I just think it's a waste of time. And when you're outdoors, you need to be as quick as possible in your mixtures, and so I don't see how that helps you if you're constantly scraping off the palette and establishing new pristine parts of your palette to make your color mixtures. You don't need to do that. Every color is essentially a little bit muddy, especially with this limited palette, and that's okay, because what ends up happening is that these colors have basically all the primaries in every one of the mixtures. You're just varying the percentage of one particular primary color or the other into your mixture, and that creates a sense of color harmony in a very natural fashion. And notice how these colors are continuing to pop off of the canvas as we continue to add them. And I'm varying some of these greens now, just ever so slightly, to give the impression that there's some variety back there. This, of course, is moving those mountains a little bit closer to us. And it is going to be by intention to bring these rock structures that you see in the photo reference a little closer to the viewer. And then just very way in the back, you see, of course, that light purple that I established. And that is going to remain rather vague. And because it's vague, it will take the viewer back towards that space. It gives depth to the painting. Now, the reference photo doesn't really show that, does it? And that's what I mean. I'm not trying to make this painting into a photorealistic painting. I'm simply using it for compositional purposes. And in order to make this a more interesting painting, I believe that keeping it somewhat vague in that in between where these large rock structures meet to help go further back to give a sense of mystery. As the further back you go, less detail, and more the feeling, the sense that you could journey past these rock structures along this river and see more interesting things. Here, just giving a little bit more attention to the foreground area. We'll be developing that as we go along. And here, notice something that the mixtures of the greens, I'm using the purple under painting, the block in, the dark colors, is a reminder of what tonal value I want. Now, we could have used almost any color to create that underpainting with the tonal values. You could have used titanium white with ivory black and done it that way. Of course, that usually doesn't produce very great color values, though. You can almost turn that into a no-tan, though, right? In terms of instead of a little thumbnail drawing using pencil and paper, white and black, to get your tonal values and shades down. You can do it right on the canvas, like I've shown you today in this painting, with the ultramarine and naphthol red mixture. This purple and just varying the tonal values from darkest to lightest. But when you do a dark like this, especially when you're a landscape painter, you can take full advantage of complementary colors, right? So notice how putting that yellow down really helps the purple stand out a little bit more, making the purple a little bit more intense, a little bit darker as it comes in contact with that yellow. And notice too, certainly that's not an exact match to the foliage that we see in the reference photo, but it doesn't have to be. It just needs to relate in the same way to the other colors that I put down previously. I could almost paint this scene in any color I wanted to. The only thing you have to really pay attention to are the tonal values correct in relationship to the other colors that you've laid down. And see how that yellow pops, especially next to the lake that still has a lot of the purple on it. Now we're going to soften these, of course, as we go along. That's not going to stay that way because we're going to paint over that I keep calling it a lake, but it's actually a river. And now I'm just showing you that I'm adding some phthalo blue to the palette. This is what I call one of the super colors. You have to use it sparingly. You notice I just had a 37 milliliter tube of that, Gamlin's 1980 line. Especially with the power lines, power colors like that. Sometimes you're almost better off getting the student grade, and that's a student grade Gamblin. But it's so richly pigmented that having it in the student grade helps you to control that color a little bit better than if it was in the professional strength, if that makes sense, because all you need is a little bit of that paint out of the tube, and you can come up with some really good mixtures. So keep that in mind. And so now we're adding some of that into the foreground, and we're going to come back in later on as I paint it. It's a little bit too unnatural of a green. Oftentimes I don't even add it on my palette for that very reason, that the phthalo blue, when mixed with my other colors, I just find that I end up wanting to tone that color down because it just does not look as natural as the other pigments that are on my palette. Always good, a reminder to step away from the painting, take a look at what you're doing, refocus yourself on some of the things you're working on in a particular painting. Like at this juncture, I'm stepping away to see if the tonal values look correct, to remind myself that I don't want to focus in on detail. I just want to get the major shapes in. And even as I'm going over this underpainting with some more pigments that are going to more closely match what I see in the reference photo, that I want to do so with as few of brush strokes as I possibly can. And once in a while, I'm going to be reestablishing some of these darks. Of course, when you're painting water, one hint that you may have gotten from other artists is that the closer, at least, that you get in the foreground, just pull those strokes down, and making sure that all of those strokes go in a downward fashion, not horizontal but vertical. It's easier for the eye, at least, because the way the light reflects on it, it looks more like water. Now, in this case, you'll notice that the reference photo has it's brown water. In Missouri and other states, that's usually the color that you see a river. Sometimes we will take and we will exaggerate that to have more blues in it, make it a little bit more pleasing. Oftentimes that just depends on the artist's mood. And on this particular day, I just felt like there were enough other colors here in the sky, in the foliage, in the mountains, that I could stay closer to the actual color of the river. And so that river green is kind of a brownish green, but it actually has the Hansa yellow light, ultramarine blue in it. It has the Naphthol red as well. So it's basically the primaries all mixed together, and just varying the percentage. And if you noticed on my palette, I'm still working with some of those same original puddles or pools of color that I did at the very start. Now, right now, it's not at a stage where I would call it a very pretty painting yet. And sometimes what we want is not a pretty painting. Maybe we want to explore some other things in regards to producing a work like this. Here, of course, I'm seeing that they're obviously in the reference photo. You see where the light is hitting the water, and so there's a variation in the color of the water, and I'm trying to emulate that by adding just a little bit of titanium white to the puddle of color that's already on my palette. A palette knife can be an essential tool sometimes. As you see here, just taking that and pulling some of that paint across, pulling some of the paint off as well. It can be helpful. Straightening up a line or two there, or erasing a line or two. Palette knives can be very helpful for that. Once in a while, I'll paint an entire painting with a palette knife just as practice for how to use a palette knife, if that makes sense. Notice still that so we've started with the darks and we put the other colors on top of those. We've worked on the foreground now, and the lightest area, of course, is the sky. And working from dark to light, the next area that we are going to cover up is the sky. And notice that you can't see all the purple through the colors anymore, but you can see little portions of it, and that can really help us in the final painting, especially if you have been painting with just a white canvas and not doing any kind of a block in ahead of time. Sometimes there's nothing more distracting than seeing some of that white canvas come through, and it can happen very easily, if especially if you don't use a lot of paint in your process. If you are stingy with that, sometimes what will happen is that the paint is going to adhere to your canvas. It's going to be absorbed to a small extent, and as it's being absorbed, it's going to expose some of the white pixels of the canvas cloth underneath your painting, and you really don't want that. Here now I've mixed up a brownish mixture from all the primaries, and really looking some of those shapes in the reference photo, and now highlighting it. And notice it's certainly not a match to the colors that you see in the reference photo, but I've made an artistic decision that these colors are going to be a little bit richer. And as I remember the scene, as every photo has a possibility of doing, it doesn't fully capture the color that you saw. And here we go. I'm just now varying my brushstrokes here. You'll notice that I'll leave a little bit of that purple shining through, even as I cover most of it. And that gives us a sense of some of these cliffs, arid places, places where perhaps the trees or other vegetation isn't growing, and yet not wanting to cover every bit of that purple up. And notice that just with a few of those brushstrokes on that top cliff area there, didn't that produce enough detail for us? In fact, I would overwork it if I were to go back in at this point and try to vary the colors or to get more strokes over top. So keep that in mind, so that you want to be very intentional with each of your brush strokes, so that you are providing some variety, and you want to try to leave things well enough alone. Because if you go over top of too many colors or paint the oil into the oil too many times, it's going to become harder for the canvas to accept it. Here, I'm realizing that purple is a little bit too strong. I've covered up that a little bit in the center of the painting. Is what I'm trying to do now is really work on the sky. And for the most part, that paint is already dry because I kept it so thin with Gamsol. Although Gamsol does dry rather slowly, especially at this time of the year. I'm painting in January here in my basement studio, and so there's not going to be as much evaporation of the Gamsol off the canvas as you might think, especially in comparison to if we were painting outside. This is another good portion of the video for a reminder that if you're enjoying this content, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be one of the first ones notified when I have posted another instructional video. And give a thumbs up to the video if you have enjoyed what I've been able to share with you. Here, of course, just another mixture now as we're going over top of the underpainting, which was all done in basically one tone with different values This is now titanium white with some ultramarine blue in it. And see, if you keep the oils very thin in your underpainting, now you come back with a little bit more paint here. So you can kind of see that. This is now, I'm using a number 8 hog bristle brush and really getting that full of paint. And then notice that I'm just being very careful not to disturb too much the paint underneath and putting these pieces of paint down over top of it. And then you notice I can only really put 2 or 3 at the most, and then I'm going back down to the palette to pick up more paint. This particular blue, you can't really see it as well on this video, but it looks a little bit more white than it will here in a minute. And part of that's just, once again, is how it looks in relationship to the purple underpainting. Eventually, this will look much different once we get all of that underpainting covered here in the sky area. And of course, as you go further up to the top of the painting is where you have more vivid blues. And so you'll notice that what I'm going to be doing is I will shift the color of blue as we get towards the top. I'll begin to mix in a little bit stronger mixtures of blue. And it takes me a while to figure out exactly the color that I want up here. Partly because that underpainting is not quite entirely dry. And so as I'm mixing that white on top of it with a little bit of ultramarine blue, it's not covering all of that purple, which actually is something that I wanted. I want a little bit of that to shine through. Doesn't have to be much, but it will provide a nice variety. At the very end, you will see me put in the clouds today. Sometimes I will leave certain parts of the underpainting not painted, where I will use that light canvas as a way to help me with the development of the clouds. But today, I'm just concentrating on painting this whole large shape of the sky, and you will see me later on come back in and apply some titanium white with a little bit of Hansa yellow light to help us, because the clouds obviously are going to reflect some of the sunlight, so we want them to be a little bit warmer temperature, and that will give us some warmth by adding the warm colors are always going to be your yellows and your reds. The cold colors are going to be your blues and your whites. In between these, I'm taking some paper towels and once in a while cleaning off that brush. If you see me move to the back of the Maybeth French easel, that's where I've got my paper towels sitting, and so I'm getting them from there. Notice how different now this painting looks. We're not quite there yet. It still looks more white than blue. And so now I'm going to begin to change that up some. And like I mentioned, don't worry. Sometimes what happens is you have to cover the whole thing at once before you can really judge how it looks next to the other colors. At this point, almost all of the underpainting is entirely covered. Or at least it may seem that way. Like I said, especially on a canvas panel like this, there are little pixels, if you will, of the canvas that show through. But now, instead of just the gessoed titanium white surface shining through, you have some of this purple coming through, which will give a little bit more interest in the final painting because of that. Not much, but just enough in my mind. Of course, the more and more you paint, you will discover your own tendencies, what colors you like, what values you wish to express, what details to put in, what to leave out. Now you will notice that, and I'm at least noticing that the yellow foliage that's in front of the mountains there are a little too intense, and certainly more yellow than green. Eventually, I will mix another green, and instead of blurting out that whole area, what I will do is use that as the highlight that I've already got down there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reintroduce some darks on top of the lights. And that's easier to do than adding lights to an already light color. So think about that. In other words, it's really more about the darks than it is the lights. You're going to be tempted to want to mix in to your mixtures a lot of titanium white to get it more vibrant. And actually, it works against you because then your colors will get chalky and actually less vibrant and become more of a problem in a painting. Always reach for titanium to lighten the color last. Use your warmer colors to do it first. Your yellows, your reds. That will give you a more saturated color. In other words, more vibrancy in the color. Here, just working on some more foliage as we bring it around. Adding some green mixtures that are a little bit more natural in their color orientation than the mixtures I had made with the phthalo blue. And if I hadn't mentioned that before, if you are a beginner, you may not want to put any phthalo blue on your palette yet. Whether that's phthalo blue or phthalo green. They are very intense colors, and really, if you don't use them in very small amounts, they can easily take over your palette and ruin a painting. Because to my mind at least, unless you're mixing in a lot of other colors into it, they usually produce tones that just seem a little bit fake. In other words, they create greens that you just really don't find necessarily in nature, or even blues. And so the best approach when you're using those, at least what I do, is I'm mixing other colors into it to deaden the color. Once again, there's a need to step back from the painting once in a while, see what is needed, and now you see me mixing another color here on the palette that we will now apply to the painting. Oftentimes just a sort of randomness, varying your brush strokes and so forth. Notice I'm not really painting bushes here. I'm not painting trees. What I'm thinking about is just introducing and showing some of the color variations I notice in the reference photo. I'm not trying to get all of those leaves right, for example. I just want to get your attention, convey the scene in as little time and effort as possible. And you don't have to paint lots of detail in order to accomplish that. Here you see that darker area in the foreground, and so I've varied this brown mixture to try to get an approximate color towards that end. And then I see some of these spots on the cliffs, and so I'm adding another mixture here. I believe this is burnt sienna mixed in with some yellow ochre. Not much, but just a little bit. And keep in mind, who's going to see your reference photo? I have no intention of hanging the reference photo right next to the painting when I'm done. And your goal should never be to compare it to the reference painting and say, oh, the reference photo rather, and say, oh, I captured it exactly the way I see it in the photo. If you're doing that, then why do you need to paint it? You can just take a photo. And photos are their own art form. But we are doing a painting, and so we're attempting to do something else. In my mind, it's to simplify the scene as much as possible, to give you a sense that the painting was almost effortless, and yet at the same time conveys to you a sense of what it was like to be in that physical space, viewing this scene. Something that goes well beyond the scope of taking a photo. Notice too that we're working constantly around the painting. In other words, we never finish one section before we finish the rest. We're constantly going from one area to another area and back again. Here I'm working on the palette. This is where a palette knife can be helpful in helping to mix some of your mixtures. Putting some more medium into the mixtures as well. As I may have mentioned before, titanium white dries rather slowly, and so I'm constantly putting some medium into my titanium white, especially near the later stages of a painting. And notice, like for example, I was covering up the purple underpainting for the sky. Then I moved to sections of the foreground in order to allow that skyline to dry a little bit more. And after that does that, I'm going to mix some other blues and begin to introduce those into the sky. But I'm intentionally waiting and holding off on that area to allow things to shape up and to firm up a little bit before I actually go back in and do that. Once again, that all involves you painting a lot of paintings and beginning to notice the tendencies of the different colors, their drying rates, etc. Here I'm just showing you, once again, me mixing into the pools of color that are already on the palette and varying them ever so slightly with the minimum palette of colors. So now, once again, one way that oils are so fantastic is that you can, if you make a mistake, you can go back in, sometimes many times, and paint over top of what you put down before. I'm noticing that it's much lighter right in between those mountains, and so to accentuate that, I'm putting this lighter shade of blue. It doesn't look blue on your television screen right now, but television screen or your computer screen or iPad or wherever you're watching this today. But it will make a little bit more sense once I introduce the darker blue tones. And notice what just the addition of a couple of colors can actually do for a painting. I'm not really happy with the painting right at this moment in time, but once I'm able to put in these darker blues along with some lighter blues in the sky with this variation, I think it is such a it's a much more pleasing painting. And like I said, it's all about how these colors relate to one another as opposed to isolated colors. See how that sharpens up this rock area and really brings a sense of realism even into this painting, which is impressionistic, but certainly we want it to lean towards capturing the essence of the scene. Also in the sky, same way that we do our water, I find that it's very helpful to paint in vertical strokes. This eliminates some of the shadows that can come into a painting because of its proximity to the light source. Like I mentioned earlier, I will come back in soon and put the clouds. I'll also do a little bit of work with a chip brush, just a 1-inch chip brush to help to feather out and loosen up so that we don't have lines appearing in the sky area. We're going to use that chip brush as a blender. If you have a fan brush, you could also use a fan brush that will accomplish the same thing. Since I wanted to do it in a little bit different fashion, I reached for the chip brush this time. See where you see that very evident line there between the blue and the white? We'll want to get rid of that, obviously. And so here, one of the things I like to do before blending is to make sure that I clean the excess paint out of the paintbrush. You don't have to clean it at this point. In fact, I try not to clean my brushes during the painting process other than pulling the paint out with a paper towel, not trying to rely too heavily on Gamsol as a cleaning agent for the brushes. And notice here by just kind of lightly feathering, this is a completely dry brush, you can end up with some very natural type of effects. And notice now that blue is really taking shape, and yet there's also a color variation moving up to the very top of the canvas. You see that there's also, when you look at the sky, there will usually be one side of the sky that's a little bit more pigmented than the other in terms of the brilliance of the blue or the darkness of the blue. Always keep that in mind. That will help you provide a little bit more variance if you're able to see that and communicate that in your paintings. It certainly adds to some realism, because in most realistic scenes, when you're looking at that sky, it's certainly not just a flat blue. It has nuances. It has different shapes, different textures, even different colors in it. And so we want to make sure that we're seeing that correctly. Now here, notice what I'm doing. This is just titanium white with a little bit of Hansa yellow in it to warm up the clouds a little. And I'm looking at the reference photo and placing these little blobs of paint where I see those clouds at. And I didn't fuss about it. I just put the paint down. It doesn't look quite right yet, and that's okay, because what I'm going to do now is, now that I've got those blobs down, I'm going to use Mother Nature and just take this chip brush and go around the edges of the shapes I put down and just feather it out a little bit so that way it looks more like a cloud as opposed to a piece of paint thrown on a canvas. And I'm doing that in this area there by the summit of that rock formation as well. And notice how that quickly changes the painting. And I think makes it much more effective. In relationship to this blue, it really calls forth the greens, even the yellows, and the greens in the foreground as well. Here, I'm concentrating on the fact that even though we don't have a lot of shadows in this reference photo of the tree line in the water, there's a little bit of that. You do see that on the left-hand side of the painting, and so I've given a little bit more attention to that, as well as the right side that we are eventually getting to as well. Wanting to preserve some of the mystery going back into the painting towards those distant rock formations that right now are reading a little bit more pinkish purple in the middle of the page, or the middle of the painting rather. Here I'm not quite happy with what's in the center of the painting with those distant ones, so I'm taking this is a number 4 round brush. It's from the Imperial line. I believe it's a kind of a squirrel hair, I think. And using that to change the shapes up a little bit here. Once again, oils are so forgiving. You'll notice that I can come back over top with a mixture of the titanium white, covering up some of the pinkish purple that I had put down earlier. But here again, notice that I saved it till almost the very end. And how, even with these rocks and with the foliage, I really have not gotten into much detail. Instead, I've created an illusion of detail by really concentrating on what to leave out as opposed to what to add. I could really have overworked this painting if I was trying to get every single bush or tree that we see in the foreground or in the distant foreground in front of these rock formations. Same could be said for the river itself. It's almost a flat color as you see it in the reference photo, with a little bit of the area in the center of the painting where obviously it's receiving the most light bouncing up off of the river. Here, just flicking this brush up and down can create some what I would call marks of God. In other words, I'm not trying to control them in any way. I want to give a sense of the randomness that you find in nature. And in the reference photo, you'll notice that we see some of that foliage, especially towards the front left section of the painting, where we see some foliage kind of overgrowing that bank. And so I'm playing that piece up as a device to get you into the painting, and then constantly looking back into the painting for more of a sense of the details that really are there. But on first glance, perhaps you don't see that. So it keeps your engagement as long as possible looking around this painting. Once again, working from darks to lights. Now I'm putting some of the lights back in the foreground. And at this point, I'm almost done. I'm taking a step back to see if there's some other details that are necessary. I like to sign my paintings with a little, what they call an eraser. It's a tool that basically has the head of a pencil or other shapes made out of rubber upon which you can remove paint. Here, just adding a few more random strokes to give a sense of nature. And there you see me signing the painting, and we're almost done now. So we'll get a chance to take one last look at the painting, and I want to thank you for watching the video today. I hope that this has added something to you. There'll be some suggestions here. You can click on the next video, painting demonstration I've done to learn even more, and be sure to subscribe to the channel.